I have to say I'm very pleased to do the introduction tonight because Syd is one of my favorite people and one of my favorite biologists who um, always generously gives of his knowledge and his time. And so I really want to welcome Syd Cannings for tonight's talk. Uh, he's a species at risk biologist for the Canadian Wildlife Service based in Whitehorse in the Yukon, where he works on a variety of issues dealing with assessment, listing, and recovery of species at risk, everything from bumblebees to bears. And since 2012, he has been a representative for the Canadian Wildlife Service on the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC. In the more distant past, he was the curator of the insect collection at the University of British Columbia, and then moved to the BC Conservation Data Centre as Program Zoologist from 1991 to 2002. He's the author of a number of books with his brothers and others, including British Columbia Natural History, the new BC Roadside Naturalist, and Geology of British Columbia Journey Through Time. He's also a good friend to many environmental nonprofits, helping out when he can, and I met him through work when I was at the Yukon Conservation Society. So I really wish to welcome a very hearty welcome to Syd Cannings.
Thanks, Deb. It's wonderful to be here. I wish I was down there in person, meeting you all and getting to know you. And I'm actually not in Whitehorse tonight. Just so you know, there's a picture of Whitehorse behind me, but I'm at a meeting in Yellowknife, and so I'm at a friend's houseboat on Back Bay on Great Slave Lake on the ice. So I'm a bit fuzzy on the screen. I hope that the other pictures come out better than that, but the hotel internet was so bad that I came down here to use her good internet. So greetings from Yellowknife. So if everybody's ready, I guess I'll just start sharing my screen and getting on with the show. The plan is, I think, Deb, that I'm giving this talk on bees, which is great, and I'm going to tell you all about bumblebees and what we're doing and what we know. And you also asked me to say a few words if there was time on COSEWIC, on the committee that we work on to assess endangered species in the country. So I don't know if that's sort of tagged on at the end. It's sort of a separate little section, if that's okay. So don't be surprised if I suddenly switch directions. Okay, here we go. So if everybody can see that.
Yeah, looks good.
It's good. Okay. So the buzz on Alberta bees. And I'll just say that I was an entomologist, as I mentioned, back in in my first career at UBC. But I must admit, then I didn't pay a single bit of attention to bumblebees. I didn't learn a thing about bumblebees. I just assumed they were one of these big charismatic megafauna of insects that was well known. We had a good collection of them there, and I didn't really touch them or collect them that much or learn about them. And it wasn't until COSEWIC started looking at some bumblebees at risk that I started getting curious and found out, again, as we usually do, how little we know about about anything, to be honest, but about insects in particular, even the big beautiful ones. So I just wanted to say a few things then about Alberta bumblebees, just to set the scene, and then we'll go into some of the ones that are endangered or threatened or whatever, and what problems they're facing, and maybe what we can do to help them out. So Alberta bumblebees, this is a Bombus frigidus from the mountains here. There's about 29 species of native bumblebees from Alberta. And I don't know how many native bees there are in total, but I'm sure there's over 200, I would think, native bees, mostly solitary bees. We'll say more about the honeybee later, but it's an introduced farm animal, as it were, not a native bee. Of those bumblebees, of those 29, 4 have been assessed as nationally at risk by our committee. Some as endangered, some as threatened, some as special concern. That's the western bumblebee in the south and the western mountains. the yellow banded bumblebee, which is a boreal kind of parkland species, mostly. The Bohemian or gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, as it's sometimes called, which is a parasite of those two species. If you want to be a parasite, don't specialize in species that become endangered or threatened, that's for sure. And again, the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee, another one, a western cuckoo bumblebee that parasitizes those ones as well. So those are the four that are really in trouble in Alberta. And they are assessed at risk because they really went through some serious declines starting in maybe the late 80s, but mostly the 1990s and up to the early 2000s. So we'll get back to all those a bit later, but I just thought before I do that, I will just run you through a little year in the life of a bumblebee so we know what bumblebees do and what they need. So we'll start at the top here. I don't know if you can see my cursor there. Here's a queen bumblebee in the early spring on like a willow catkin or something there. They just love willow catkins, by the way. So that's, you don't often think of them as bee flowers, but willows are really important for bumblebees early on in the season. So in the spring, though, the queens come out of hibernation. They've already mated in the previous fall. They've got some fertilized eggs. They go and they take some time to find a place to live over here on the right. Some burrow, some hollow in the ground, usually in the ground, occasionally above ground, but often like a rodent burrow or maybe a cottontail burrow or something like that, something that they can get underground. And they start building their little cases for their eggs, their little pots, and they start laying eggs, and they provision those growing little babies with a bit of honey. They make honey, not a lot of honey, but enough to feed their babies, and a lot of pollen. They feed the pollen. That's the big protein and fat that they feed them to make the little guys grow quickly. And then in the early summer, she's building up that first generation, and those ones will hatch out as workers. Her female, her daughters that help her later in the summer raise more and more bumblebees. And so by what we call late summer, and that can change depending on where you are. In the Yukon, for example, where I live, late summer for a bee is the last week of July, say, or maybe the first couple of days of August. But at that time, the last generation of these baby bees hatch out, and those are the males, the fertile males and females of the next year's generation. And they hatch out at the end of summer. As you probably know, like middle of August in the Yukon is like fall. So before that, these guys hatch out, they mate. The mated females then go and find a nice cozy place to spend the winter, which isn't as fancy as this springtime place, but it's just somewhere they can get below, not necessarily below ground, but under the leaf litter or under a log or in a log or something away from the elements, and get under a big patch of snow there for a while and stay warm and cozy through the winter, and then the whole thing starts over again. So that's the bumblebee year. So basically the queen starts off on her own. They hatch out a lot of babies. They make a few more at the end of the year, and then these queens overwinter, and then they disperse in the spring and start everything fresh. So there's no nest that lasts through the winter. It's all starts over again every year. So with that in mind, what do bumblebees need? Well, the first thing, of course, is that they need food. They need a diversity of flowers through the entire growing season, and that's from early May right through till middle of August at least, and perhaps further into maybe even into September where you live. They're generalist feeders. They don't specialize on a particular plant. Some bumblebees have short tongues and some have long tongues. The ones with short tongues can't necessarily get to the bottom of the big long tubular flowers, but sometimes they cheat by biting them. And again, the females make the nests, the queens make the nests in rodent or rabbit burrows or some other underground places. So they need the ground with natural cavities and a cozy place to hibernate. So that's what they need. So here's just focusing for a bit on these 4 species at risk, so you know what we're concerned about. This is a Western bumblebee. It's listed now as threatened under the Species at Risk Act nationally. And this was once one of the commonest bumblebees in the southern mountains. Like literally, like 1 out of every 3 or 4 bumblebees that you would see would be this species in, say, Calgary or Canmore. Big declines, as I mentioned, in the 1990s through 2000s. And that means around a 90% decline in some areas, in some southern areas. But it may still be okay in the wilder areas of mountains and the north. We don't have a lot of data on numbers in the sort of wilder areas, but I'll get into that in more detail. So how do you tell a Western bumblebee? This is a nice view of a queen here. So you can see it's got a black head, a black face, everything's black. It's got a white tail. It's got a black, the rest of the abdomen is all black. So it's very simple pattern. Black head, this nice yellow band here at the front of the thorax. And you can tell it's not a cuckoo bee. It's got this big, wide, flat, shiny hind leg, which is where they gather the pollen in their pollen baskets. So that tells you it's not a cuckoo bee, it's a Western bumblebee. And here's a map of its range. The green is the Western bumblebee right here. So it's found all the way down to Mexico and up into a sort of central, even a bit into northern BC. And then the sort of southern western parts of Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan as well. But it has a couple of sibling species, a couple of very closely related species that it's split off with recently. This big blue one here is the yellow-banded bumblebee. We'll meet in a minute. This boreal or trans-Canada species. And then this red one up where I live in the Yukon is the McKay's bumblebee. It's the sort of Beringian, the one that survived, I assume, in the ice-free areas of the Yukon and Alaska during the period of glaciation. And they also have another close relative down here in southwestern Ontario that's pretty much extirpated from Canada. It's still in the Midwest of the States, but it's pretty much, I think it's gone from Canada. So there's something about these 3 species that are all at risk that led them to decline. Many other bumblebees are doing just fine, by the way. But these 3, especially, not the red one, yeah, the red one we're a bit concerned with, but these 2 plus this rusty patched one are doing very poorly in the south. So here's the yellow-banded bumblebee. So you can see it looks a lot like that Western bumblebee, except that instead where the abdomen was black before, it's got these 2 big yellow bands, and it doesn't have a white bum, it's got a black bum. Yellow-banded bumblebee, and it's special concern because even though there were big declines in the south, it's still apparently okay in those wilder areas in the north. And if you remember that map, it was really widespread in the north, in the northern boreal, where we don't think there's many threats to it. So we've written a management plan, et cetera, moving ahead on that one. And I'm just trying to move quickly through these. The Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee, again, is the parasite of those. It's like its name suggests, it's a cuckoo. It's like a cowbird. Doesn't necessarily kill its host, but it takes over the nests and takes command and lays its eggs. And the workers of the Western bumblebee or the yellow-banded bumblebee take care of its young and not theirs. And it's doing very poorly in the south, especially in southern Ontario and so on. And it's just vanished. It's still present in parts of Alberta, we'll see, but it's listed now as endangered. By the way, this one is found all the way around the northern hemisphere in Europe and Asia. And it's interesting because, we think of Europe as a very developed, a lot of human threats in Europe for bees, but it's still common in Europe. And that shows you that the main threat here is the fact that its hosts have declined a lot. But in Europe, its hosts are apparently doing okay. It's the common Bombus terrestris of Europe, the common bumblebee of England. And so it's doing fine. So for whatever reason, the hosts are doing terribly here, and because of that, it's doing terribly. So we've written a recovery strategy. We're trying to move forward with that and see what we can do to help these bees out. Identified critical habitat. Most of the critical habitat in Canada that we've identified is in Alberta, because that's one of the few places we can actually find these bees still in Canada, Alberta and the Yukon. And you can see it looks a lot like that Western bumblebee, except for the fact if you look at the back leg where this yellow line is, you can see it's just looks like a regular little leg. There's no broad, shiny patch with big hairs, big basket there gathering pollen, because these guys don't gather pollen for their young. They just depend on their host to feed their young. So this is definitely a cuckoo bee. But it's got the white bum, got the black head, it's got the black abdomen. Otherwise, so it looks quite a bit like a Western bumblebee. It's obviously a mimic, I guess. And just to point out that if you want to tell it from its other close relative, the suckleys, which we're going to meet in a minute, you have to look really, really carefully at the rear end here. But you really have to look much more carefully than this picture can show you. By the way, this picture was taken at Miles Canyon, just where we were talking about before the talk. So here's
Wonderful.
a map of the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee. The white dots are places where it was seen back in the distant past, like in before 2000. And the blue dots are where it's been seen more recently. And there's actually more blue dots in Alberta now, I can assure you. And we'll meet a few more blue dots here that are recently. There's one here in Manitoba. There's several in the sort of Gulf of St. Lawrence region, and one in New Brunswick. So it still exists in the east, but mostly it's vanished in the east. And it's still found in Alberta, a bit in British Columbia, and we've been doing quite a bit of work in the Yukon, and that's why there's maybe quite a few dots there too. So it's doing fine in the Northwest. Fine, I don't know. And I don't know what to say about Alberta, except that I think it's pretty rare, say around Calgary and in the real agricultural areas of Alberta. But it's still there, and it's more common probably in the wilder parts of northern Alberta. And here's its sister species, the Suckleys cuckoo bumblebee. And this is, I think of these ones, if you're a bird watcher, this is kind of like the three-toed woodpeckers. There's a pair of bumblebees, like a pair of birds, and one's predominantly Western, and that's this one here. You can see down on the left here, it's widespread in the Western mountains, and then but it's all across Canada into Newfoundland. But in Eastern Canada, it's really, really rare. And that's like the three-toed woodpecker that we have commonly in the mountains of Alberta and British Columbia and the Yukon. But it goes right across, but it gets really rare in the east. And then we have the blackback, which is common in the east, like the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee was, and is rarer in the west. So that's how I think of it. But it's scattered right across. And again, it's a parasite on the same bumblebees as the other ones, so they're doing equally poorly. This picture, by the way, was taken in Regina, or just south of Regina, so they're still in the southern prairies as well. And again, it's got the black head, black abdomen, white tail, and you can see there's no big shiny patch with big hairs there holding for pollen, because it's a parasite. Okay, those are the ones that are in trouble. I just thought I'd introduce you to a few of the common ones so you get an idea of the diversity. There won't be a quiz at this, so don't worry, but hopefully some of you might be interested in learning more after this and looking more carefully this summer. So the commonest bumblebee, at least according, these are my stats that come from iNaturalist. So depending on who puts them up on iNaturalist, this Hunt's bumblebee is the most common bumblebee of southern Alberta. Beautiful bee, yellow with black, and this broad, really stunning orangey brick red abdomen with another line of yellow there. And it's got and this is the Hunt's bumblebee is the common one of the prairie grasslands. Let's put it that way, simplified. There's a tricolored bumblebee, which looks exactly like the Hunt's bumblebee in many ways. But if you look carefully at the back where this yellow line is, you can see a kind of a division in that yellow, just a little thing, whereas the other one has more yellow. the tricolored is the sort of southern boreal, more coniferous forest species. Maybe around Edmonton and stuff like that. It reaches its southern limits, or at least gets less common south of Edmonton and Calgary. And then there's the perplexing bumblebee, all kind of yellow and black with maybe a little tiny dot on the back, but not much of a dot, just mostly all yellow in the front and black in the back. And another really common one, which looks perplexingly like the tricolored bumblebee or the Hunt's bumblebee in general pattern, but you can see the black pattern in the thorax looks like a big oval eye, and then the yellow on the front of the abdomen sort of spills back into the orange a bit. Like I say, you're not going to be tested on these. I'm just saying that you can identify these from your photographs if you take good photographs of them. And the red belted, just to make things interesting, also comes in a black belted form, like this one, but it still has that oval eye on the back. And there's the cryptic bumblebee, which is the most, I think it's most pretty bumblebee you got. It's mostly in the mountains, but it's also quite common in Calgary. Yellow, black, white. These beautiful patterns. And it's another close relative of the Western bumblebee. But for whatever reason, it didn't decline in the 90s and 2000s. It's doing fine. In fact, it's probably increasing. But it's also presumably a host for those declining cuckoo bees. And finally, the sixth most common bee is the Nevada bumblebee, which is, of course, like its name suggests, from these dry mountains of the West. And it's just, if this picture, I hope it makes it look big, because this is a huge bumblebee. It's massive, scary big, like sometimes it looks like the size of a mouse, but it's not that big, but it's really big. It's all yellow. Most of the abdomen is yellow, black end, and this big black spot on the thorax. So those are the 6 common ones, and those 6 species make up 80% of the bumblebees you see in southern and central Alberta, in the regular, not in the mountains, not up high in the mountains, but just in the areas around Calgary and Edmonton. So just back to the Western bumblebee and its troubles. This data, and I think it was collected by a fellow called Otter Statter originally, from 14 sites in southern Alberta. Again, this shows you from 1980 to 2010, it went from the 40% probability of collecting one when you went out and looked, down to less than, about 6% probability. So a huge decline in its abundance in that period, in the 30 years there, 25 years. And so the question is, why? What caused this? And the short answer is we don't really know for a fact, and it's probably a bunch of things that happened at once that didn't do well for these bees. So first of all, there's a whole group of fungal pathogens, microsporidians, that parasitize bees and other things. And there's one species called Varamorpha bombi that specializes in bumblebees. And this parasite, if it's numerous enough, can cause wing deformation after development. It decreases the survival of workers and males. It prevents queens from mating. And the thing about that sounds all bad, but if you actually look inside these bees, it's far more prevalent in those declining species than in the ones that haven't declined. So that's sort of quite suggestive. It's like it's correlated, but we don't know if it's the cause. And so why would that suddenly appear, or why would it, these parasites are in all, bumblebees everywhere, and they're native to North America. It's not as if they suddenly arrived and caused this problem in most ways, but coincident with this huge rise in the level of parasites and the decline of the bees was this big rise in managed bumblebees in greenhouses. So I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but in the 90s, especially, there was a big increase in greenhouse production of things like tomatoes and pepper, tomatoes and cucumbers and things like that. And the tomatoes and cucumbers are really need buzz pollination to be successful, especially on this industrial scale. And so people started using bumblebees in boxes, like, reared bumblebees to do this inside the greenhouses. And they took a bunch of bumblebees, sent them to Europe, and they developed these techniques and they brought them back. And it may have been in that way when they took them away and brought them back that they came back with these diseases. They always had them, as I said, so it's not clear what went on. But again, when they came back, they first of all used Western bumblebee in the West, being sensible. They didn't want to use an exotic species. So they used Western bumblebee, but Western bumblebees always got sick and died in these greenhouses, so they gave up on them. And now they use the common Eastern bumblebee, which, despite its name, is not a close relative of the Western bumblebee. And so it does fine in this situation. But the Western bumblebee didn't, and that's when the Western bumblebee really started declining, especially in agricultural areas. So that's suggestive that that's a major factor in this. There's also pathogens brought in by honeybees, honeybees being quite a close relative of bumblebees. There are viruses and other diseases that can be transferred to bumblebees in their saliva when they're feeding on the same flowers. And also, in addition to that, honeybees are very efficient, as we know. They're busy and they tell each other where the flowers are, and there's many more thousands of honeybees in these hives than there are bumblebees in a nest. So they can outnumber and outcompete native bees for the limited pollen and nectar from this area. And this standard apiary of 40 colonies can collect 400 kilograms of pollen in the summer months, which, if you can imagine, is a lot of pollen. And you can imagine that that would have a significant impact on the ability of native bees to thrive in the area. And then added on top of all that, then you have insecticides. Now, the neonicotinoid insecticides were developed because they weren't poisonous to things like bees, or they didn't kill them outright. And they were used, but they were used systemically. The plants take them up, and I could go on, but at any rate, it was thought that they would be safe. And so they introduced these insecticides widely. But as you know, the bumblebees need to survive all summer long. It's not just a little brief lifetime where they come out and they give birth to their new babies and go away. They need to be in that area all summer long. So they're exposed to these chemicals for long periods. And these chemicals may not kill them, but they show that they give them impaired learning and short-term memory problems. There's decreased foraging performance if you forget where you're supposed to go or where you go back. Reduced queen production because of all that, perhaps. And ultimately, colony failure. The colony just doesn't produce the next generation like it should. And now, because of that, there's been trying to develop replacements for these neonicotinoids, but they also have been shown to reduce production and cause lethargy in these colonial bees. There's also insecticides used in forestry. This is a picture of like spruce budworm, damage, and there's a chemical called tebufenazide that's used for that. And they've done studies to show that, again, there's no effect on bumblebee production, but at small concentrations, they cause learning deficiencies in honeybees. So it doesn't sound perfect to me. And then herbicides. Well, herbicides are supposed to kill plants, not insects. So you would think that they would be fine. But of course, they kill, let's just put it this way. There's a huge movement towards GMO herbicide-ready crops like corn and other things. And so that was resulted in a doubling of herbicide use in agriculture in Canada since 2005. And of course, the herbicides designed to keep down the weeds and allow these crops to grow. But of course, it's the sort of weedy bits around the edge of the fields that are used by the bumblebees and other bees in the wild ones that they need the flowers of and the pollen of. But if they're being killed by herbicides, that isn't available to them. And so they're also used to a certain extent in silviculture to keep down competition in tree plantations. But we don't really know much about the effect of this on the availability of flowers to bees. And then finally, in the pesticide land, there's fungicides. And again, these are supposed to kill fungi, not insects, and so they're not necessarily toxic on their own. But it's interesting that studies that were looking at the yellow-banded bumblebee found that exposure to fungicides was the strongest predictor of the prevalence of those little microsporidian pathogens. So something is odd there. Maybe just that just an indicator of the intensity of the agriculture, and everything else was adding up. So it may be just a cumulative pile of things that are just not making these bees happy when we're trying to grow our crops and so on. Adding to all that, of course, is just direct habitat loss. I live up here in the Yukon where there's hardly any people, so I don't think of this as a problem. But of course, in areas like southern Ontario, where this picture was taken, the conversion of meadows and woodlands and weedy margin to these kind of habitats is obviously reducing the habitat. Although in some cases, suburban habitats can be very friendly to bees if they're done well. But overall, it's a loss. And then finally, we're almost done. The threats part here is climate change. And of course, we know climate change is coming hard and fast, especially in the Northwest. And bumblebees, if you can guess, are cool adapted insects. They're big, they're fuzzy like that and big like that because that allows them to thrive in cool places. They can make heat with their muscles, but they don't do well where it's really hot. There are no bumblebees in the tropical lowlands. They're not a tropical thing. They're in the tropics, but up high in the mountains. So here's the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee again. This is its European distribution modeled, based on its climate envelope for 2050 and 2100. And you can see that the little green bits are way up in the north there again, but the yellow bits in the Alps and in northern England vanish and become red as the years go by here. So it's not going to be very happy in Europe in the next 80 years or so. So after all those troubles, what can we do? How can we make sure bumblebees thrive? And so one thing is to regulate those managed bee industries by really making sure that the domestic bumblebee colonies are disease-free, and especially that they are prevented from escaping from greenhouses so they don't meet up with our wild bumblebees. And also to limit the sizes of honeybee apiaries on wild lands. In some cases, we do need honeybees in big industrial agriculture, like in giant orchards or big almond plantations in the Central Valley of California or something like that. But we don't, other than for honey production, we don't need to have huge apiaries on wild lands. So it makes sense to limit the size of those so they don't compete with native bees and they don't pass on any diseases. And of course, like for most of our advice would be to use insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides only when necessary and according to best practices. The thing about those neonicotinoids is that they were designed to use all the time. It doesn't matter whether you had a problem or not. The seeds come with the neonicotinoids in them. So when you plant your crop, they're automatically filled with pesticides. So it's a problem because you're letting these pesticides into the environment even when you don't necessarily need them. And of course, this is where most people can come in, because you can just maintain flower-rich habitats. You can keep your own backyard diverse and untidy. You can keep your city diverse and untidy. And I must say, Calgary, as I think I point out in the next time, is doing a great job of this in turning its public lands into diverse and flower-rich habitats. And if you want to learn more about how to do that, there's the Xerxes Society in the States, has a website on learn about pollinators. You can copy that from the recording here and visit there, or just Google Xerxes Society pollinators. And then honeybees, of course, it's always difficult to sort of say honeybees are bad because they're not necessarily bad, and we all love honey. And it's so beekeeping has a number of benefits, but it gets confusing in the land of conservation because we often hear save the bees, and then the media is interviewing the beekeepers and not the ecologists or the people in conservation. So bee conservation is not one of the reasons to keep bees. It's the opposite. So in most situations, honeybees don't improve pollinations of wild native plants in wild situations. You know, the bumblebees and the other native bees are doing a perfectly good job. They've done it for centuries and they're doing it fine. And as we found out, honeybees can compete with native bees and spread diseases. And so I like to point out, it's like keeping chickens, you know, like when you're beekeeping, you're keeping animals for their agricultural benefit. You're getting honey. That's great. I love honey. They're pollinating your crops. If you've got some crops that need extra pollinating, which you often may not need if you've got a small crop. And you know, you never hear someone say, "Oh, we need to conserve the birds. You better keep more chickens." You know, it just doesn't sound right. And that's exactly what we're saying with honeybees. So I won't say anything more about that. And then we'll move right on to if the naturalists among you want to learn about how to identify bumblebees. I don't want to discourage you right away, but it is harder than you think. When I first started getting interested in bumblebees about 14 years ago, I thought, well, you know, it's going to be easy. They're big, they're colorful, they got these patterns. We'll just, and then there's a book come out, I'll show you in a minute. But there are these bees like the two here. This is the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee, the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, and this is the Western bumblebee. Well, you know, they look almost exactly the same, you know, and you can see the difference in their legs here. This is Western, so you got to look very carefully. You got to get a photograph with that or see that. And if you want to tell this one from the Suckleys, you need to look at the rear end here. And by golly, that flower is just covering the wrong thing there. So you've lost that possibility. So, but other bees are more easy, like the Nevada bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee. These are all easy to identify. These ones, the red belted one. So, you know, give it a go. In cameras these days are fantastic. You can take really good pictures, but get a picture from every possible angle. That's the message, because you need to take a picture of the rear end, the side, the head, all that stuff to get a really good identification on these things. And you can submit your photos to iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch, and they'll be identified by it. If you put it up on iNaturalist, I can almost guarantee you that John Asher will identify you within 24 hours. And John Asher is one of the world experts on bees. So it's like sending it off to the world expert and having a personal identification. So, and by doing that, you contribute, you know, greatly to our knowledge of bumblebee or other bee distribution. So I'd really encourage taking pictures and putting them up on these platforms, because it really helps a lot of research, as well as I hope gives you some pleasure in doing that. There's also collecting, and I'm an insect collector from way back, and in many cases sort of swear by it, because we really need, you know, specimens can. And there's also this book, sorry, I forgot to tell you, there's a Bumblebees of North America, which you can get through Princeton University Press online. It's a pretty good book. They're talking about putting out another edition, which would be even better. You know, there's no great mistakes in it, but it's not perfect the way it is. But I shouldn't say that, but it's a good book. It's way better than nothing, and it makes it really interesting, actually. Got great maps, things like that. But anyways, collecting, I don't know if I'm going to, oh yeah, sorry. I'm going to just say something more about collecting, that you can do a lot of, especially if you have access to a good collection, like University of Calgary collection or the collection at the University of Alberta that will take your specimens if you do it properly and teach you how to do it, because there's so much more you can learn from a specimen than from a photograph. We do a lot of genetics these days on these things, and you can do the genetics on the pollen of them that are on their bodies at the same time, and so you learn a lot more about the bees from collecting. And as I said, there's many times, especially when it really counts, when you're trying to tell the difference between a Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee and a Suckleys, that you just cannot do it from a photograph. Anyway, what's going on in Alberta? Well, the short answer is lots, and this is great news. For a long time, the University of Calgary has been a real leader in bumblebee biology studies. Paul Galperin there is a landscape ecologist, doing a lot of work on bumblebees and the agricultural landscape. Ralph Carter, who has recently retired, has done a lot on bumblebee ecology. Mount Royal University has Robin Owen. And Alberta Environment Parks, David Prescott was leading some bumblebee work, although he's retired now too. Hopefully they're continuing that work. And Calgary, I mentioned before, is now an official bee city since 2019, and that's thanks to people like David Misfeld. There's an Alberta Native Bee Association that you might want to look up, Megan Evans and others, and they're doing a lot of really far-reaching bee surveys, and we're discovering a lot of great things about the bumblebees of Alberta through their work. And there's a National Bee Diagnostic Center in Beaver Lodge, which is mostly focused on honeybees, but is doing a lot of work with bumblebees and other native bees as well. So there's a lot going on if you want to get involved. Just to show you, I think I showed you that picture earlier of the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee distribution in Alberta, and there was like 3 dots recently in it. Well, just from the Alberta Native Bee Association work and Paul Galperin's work and others, and David Misfeld's and David Prescott's work, we can see that Bohemian cuckoo bumblebees are still widespread in Alberta. Again, I think they look like they're super common around Red Deer, but that's because that's where Paul Galperin was doing his work, but they're really widespread and probably doing very well in the north. Just another bit of word on these declines and how we measure them. That when we looked at COSEWIC, when COSEWIC looked at these bumblebees, we had a bit of trouble actually assessing them as endangered or threatened because we need really good data on declines. And we just had these really good surveys from southern Alberta, and I think one from the Fraser Valley for western bumblebee, but that was it. We had no idea, and these are wide-ranging bees. We just didn't have data, so we could say that in certain places they were doing very poorly, but and bees have been intensively and extensively sampled in the last 20 years, but in an ad hoc fashion. And when the statisticians on COSEWIC were looking at it, they were rolling their eyes, and saying, this is just relative abundance and we can't really say, et cetera, et cetera. So some of us on the committee said, we need better data. We need real trend data. We need real repeatable and easy to undertake surveys that will tell us exactly what's going on in the numbers of bees. Something that's widespread, like the breeding bird survey. Now, I don't know how many of you are birders or how many of you actually volunteer and go out on these breeding bird surveys, but they're all across North America, into Mexico, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of them everywhere. And, volunteers like you and I go out there once a year and count birds early one morning and do it in a very systematic way. We go to the same places every year, same time, same number of minutes counting birds. And that's what the bird people use to assess the status of birds. So we thought, why not the bumblebee survey? That's the same letters, unfortunately, too. It's the BS. So what we've done, we did this in the Yukon for the last 7 years. We've gone out for between 10 and 20 surveys a year just to see what we could do. And we modeled it on the bumblebee, on the bird surveys. We went to the same survey routes as the bird surveys along these roads. Whereas the birds stop 50 times over 40 kilometers, we stop 10 times, but we count bees for 10 minutes at a time at each spot. Anyways, the main point is we go to the same spots every year, summarize it over a survey route, and this is what we found. So this is over the last 6 years, I think. You can see we've got many of the species of bumblebees in the Yukon. We've got the 3 common ones, including this McKay here, which is one of our species of concern. But it seems to be doing very well. Thank you very much. And here's our cuckoo bees over here, the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee and the Suckleys here. They're very rare, but you would expect parasites to be rare anyways. But the point is they're still hanging on here and up in the Yukon and doing fine. And we can even then use modeling to assess the reoccurrence probability of these species over the years. And this is over all routes. This is this cryptic bumblebee. And you can see looks like there may be a slight decline, but the error bars are pretty wide here. And the 5-year trend estimate is a little below in the decline range. So maybe it's declining, but obviously it would be better if we did more surveys and more broadly did them. So my plea here is, if anyone in the audience is interested in doing these surveys, we're trying to there was many more done in British Columbia last year and the year before. There's some done in Northern Ontario. There's been some done in the Maritimes. So we really want to spread it across Canada. So if you're interested in doing one of these surveys, I can tell you a lot more about it, but you can email me at that email address, or Kirsten Wilcox, who's a colleague of mine at Canadian Wildlife Service. I've given you my Gmail account here because I'm retiring soon, so I don't want to miss your email. But please get in touch with us if you want to get involved. I'd really appreciate any more and get involved. Megan Evans, by the way, in the Alberta Native Bee Society, I think is going to try to do a few of these in southern Alberta, so you could reach her if you know her and get on her team. So that's sort of the end of the bee talk. We can answer questions about that a little maybe later. I'll just try to run through very quickly, just explaining what COSEWIC is and what it does. The Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. Is it okay? Are we okay for time, Deb? Or okay, perfect. So COSEWIC has been around for quite a while, for what's that, almost 50 years now. Established in 1977, long before the Species at Risk Act. Even back then, it was an independent body of biologists that got together to assess the status of Canadian species. But when the Species at Risk Act came along in 2003, I actually learned today it was 2002, but it was legally recognized under that act. And and so in that act, it was designated as the organization, the independent organization that would advise the federal minister of the environment on which species should be considered for legal listing. Didn't mean that they would be listed, but it was the advisory body. So it's a big group. They're all appointed by the Minister of the Environment, but once they're appointed, they're independent. We can get on that in a minute. 61 members when it's fully fledged there. 8 of those are from federal departments like Canadian Wildlife Service, Parks Canada, DFO, etc. 26 are like 2 from every province and territory. 20 co-chairs of the 10 species specialist subcommittees, which we'll learn about in a minute. 2 each, I think we'll mean 2 co-chairs of the Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee, 3 non-government scientists, and 2 early career scientists. Anyways, it's a big crowd from all across Canada and all ranges of biology that get together twice a year. And as I mentioned before, it's an independent body. They're appointed by the minister, and they're from their governments or from their organizations. But when we're together meeting and discussing species, we do not represent our organizations, our governments, or anybody else, and nobody can tell us how to vote. And believe me, nobody does. And the evaluations are only based on available evidence, science or traditional knowledge. They're not based on, we don't go out and look for new evidence. We don't have a budget to do that. We just look at what's available. And we have to ignore all social, economic, or political considerations. That's not to say those are ignored in the Species at Risk Act. Those are specifically given, those considerations are given to government, to politicians to look at when it's listing time. But in the species assessment, like here in one of our meetings, we just look at the science and the knowledge. So we identify priority species first in a variety of ways, in quite rigid ways, to be honest. When we've decided which species we should be looking at, we commission a status report. And then every year we meet twice to assess those species status. And we are required to reassess every 10 years. And that's a bit problematic now. There's so many of them, but we can talk more about that later if you have questions. And we do them by very specific criteria that are pretty much exactly like the International Union of Conservation of Nature's assessment criteria. We've adapted them slightly sometimes. But there's 4 main criteria. One is a large recent decline. Another is some species, and that's like this gypsy cuckoo or the Bohemian cuckoo bumblebee here. It's a large recent decline. So that's how it got assessed as endangered. Or, the species sometimes can have a very small distribution, like a little endemic plant, something that's found only, I don't know, only on the east slope of the Rocky Mountains between these 2 rivers or something like that, and a continuing decline. C is a small population size and a continuing decline. And then D is just like a very small remnant population or very restricted in area. So something like on an island, or it's just the last of the last. And it doesn't have to be declining, it just has to be very small. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to go further. That was a bit of a rush through on the COSEWIC thing, but I'd be happy to go into more details.
Okay, thank you, Syd. I guess I'll just ask one question because I can. Is there one particular incident in your research with bumblebees that sort of comes to mind as being an important point in your career of studying bumblebees?
What so a personal event?
Yeah, so just something in your research or a personal event that, like finding that elusive species, or learning about something different or new about a specific bumblebee that really stuck with you.
When we go out looking, like we do these roadside surveys every year, and we catch a lot of bees. It's always a wonderful surprise to find these, like cuckoo bees, for example, so it's really good to know they're still out there and they're doing fine. So I always get a thrill with that. One thing we did once that was really amazing was, and this was before I even really got started. It was just as I was getting started interested in bumblebees. And we were actually up in the high mountains of Kluane looking for rare endemic moths that are found nowhere else in the world. So we knew there was one species up there that we wanted to find and learn more about. And while we were waiting for the helicopter, we were just catching bugs, And so we caught a couple of bumblebees that afternoon while we waited for the helicopter. And then I sent them. I didn't know anything about bumblebees at the time, and I didn't even know what it was. So I just sent them to Corey Sheffield, who is the curator of entomology at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, and he's the Canadian bee expert. And he didn't know he knew they were sort of an interesting group, so he took some genetic samples from them and sent them to the world bee expert in the London, the Natural History Museum in London. And it turns out it's a new species of bumblebee. This is like a big bumblebee. It's not small, and it's like when you're up there, it's common. It's like all over the place. but it was one of these cryptic species that looks a lot like another common one, but it's different when you actually look carefully. It's different, and so we got that. Just shows me like how wrong I was earlier on when I thought we knew everything there was to know about bumblebees because they're big and charismatic. But if you can find a new species, it's quite easy to find a new species of fungus gnat or something, but to find a new species of bumblebee was quite something. So that was a real thrill. So that's
Awesome.
the Kiwani bumblebee.
Nice.
So now I'm looking at the chat now from
Yeah.
Catherine. So
Yeah.
Catherine asks, do worker bees hibernate also? What keeps the bees alive while hibernating? Is it for bears? It's their fat stores. So the worker bumblebees do not hibernate. The only bumblebee that survives the winter is the queen. So all the males, all the workers die at the end of summer, at the very, I guess, I don't know, if it's the frost or just the lack of flowers that, lack of, there's not much nectar for them to keep their energy going there. So they all die. But the queen finds these nice little cozy places. They're not hot, but they can get, they're real hibernators. They're getting completely dormant, but the temperature doesn't go below, -5 or -6 under all that snow. So they don't use up much fat in the hibernating process. So bears are a bit, they're not real true hibernators in the sense that they're really low in temperature and they're hibernating, but they they do, use up their fat stores when they're hibernating. Whereas the bumblebees, like all insects, are just the temperature of the ground. And so they don't, they might use up a tiny amount, but they don't really need their fat stores. They just need to find a place that's not going to go way up and way down and not fluctuating, something that's nice and relatively consistent in cold temperatures. So yeah, that would be my answer. I'm not a physiologist, but that would be what I would think. So
So
Rich,
there,
oh sorry.
yeah, go ahead. You can read
It
them
says
just as
that
well as I
I
can.
noticed that the bees seem to prefer purple flowers. Is there any science backing them up? There are many YouTube showing how to make bumblebee. Okay. The purple flowers. Let me think. I obviously, there's a lot of purple, blue flowers that bees love, and there's a way of trapping bees. A lot of research scientists like Paul Galperin use these traps called blue vein traps, which are just like pickle jar kind of size things with these big blue 4 cross veins on there, and the bees are attracted to the blue and hit them and fall into the trap. So they I do they seem to prefer that purple or blue in that sense, but they also visit flowers of other colors, like they visit a lot of white flowers and they love yellow as well. So it's not just blue. And they do change. As I said, they're generalist feeders. So they learn every day. They go out and they find out which plants are producing the pollen and the nectar they need. And then for a while they focus on that flower, whether it's a white flower or a yellow flower or a blue flower. So, but blue flowers are obviously really popular with them. They also, of course, see ultraviolet that we cannot see. And so who knows what they're seeing in those flowers? I don't know for a fact myself, but they definitely know the patterns and the colors that are working that day and go there. There are many YouTube showing how to make bumblebees houses overturned terracotta pots. I don't know about the overturned terracotta pots. I know you can, like a lot of people make bumblebee houses like bird boxes, like out of wood. And but instead of like a little hole where the bird would go in and out of, there's a little tube like a cylinder that goes into the box, and then you bury the whole bee box in the ground and then have this tube sticking out. So then they wait, they hope that the queens can find those tubes just like a little mouse hole and go down and find this cozy place to have a nest. So you can, the short answer is yes, you can make bumblebee houses, and I would encourage that. But like bird boxes, sometimes you might get a 10 or 20% return max on your efforts, which, so if you're into making a lot of houses, you will get bumblebees nesting in them. I can't say how many, would be occupied at any one time. But yeah, no, there's a lot of work being done on that. And that would work, especially if you're in an area, a really highly developed area with few opportunities for bees to find those natural cavities. Brenda says, is there any traditional knowledge about bees, especially the at-risk ones? I'm sure there's traditional knowledge about bees, but I don't know of any traditional knowledge that distinguishes this species, especially the at-risk ones, because we know very little about them, in really terms of Western science of really manipulating them and holding them in the lab and finding out which bees they parasitize and so on. I don't think there would be traditional knowledge. I'm sure there's stories and maybe even legends about them. I honestly don't know. What would be more helpful for bumblebees at home, creating food sources or creating habitat? Well, I guess the answer is both. Planting native flowers is always good, especially if you can have flowers, like I said, through the seasons. Like, don't just plant one big patch of I don't know, whatever, that's only going to bloom in the last half of June. Make sure that you've got something blooming in May and something blooming in August, that to keep them going through there. And then the habitat that goes with that, the nesting habitat, for example, or the hibernation habitat can be separate and a little bit distant from that, but the closer it is, the better. So, but if they have habitat, and if you have bee boxes, or if you have little holes for them, and there's as I said, there's hundreds of other native bees that aren't bumblebees as well, like the leafcutter bees and other things that you can make those little tube homes with, like drilling holes in wood or having hollow straw-like things that are all stuck together in little bee hotels. Yeah, there's lots you can do to create that artificial habitat, but the easy way to do it is to keep a huge diversity of flowering plants going with messy gardens that have loose soil, so that other things can, I don't know, so the queens can overwinter right there if they want to.
Okay, are there any last questions? If not, I just want to really thank Syd for giving this excellent presentation. And yeah, it is challenging getting all those different directions when you're shooting photos, but I'm always appreciative of people on iNaturalist who take the time to give me feedback on my photos as well. I'm learning as I'm going, and I think I'm getting better at taking photos of different species. So
Yeah.
I'm always grateful for everyone who's spent the time to teach me why one one bee is not the bee that I assume it is. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I didn't mention, but there's a lot of online resources for identification as well. The US people have a bunch of sort of big poster-like identification things going, and but iNaturalist teaches you very quickly what you saw, right? And so that's nice. And you won't always get a picture of every angle, just put it up on iNaturalist, even if you just get one sort of semi-bad picture, and see what happens, because sometimes it's easy to identify that particular one, but
Mhm.
you
Well,
can't
thank
all.
you so much, Syd. This was a really great presentation. I'm sure people are going to be looking at the video again after. I know I will. Um,
Well, great.
I've gotten better at trying to identify Alberta species since moving here because I've focused on it a lot. And we've had a lot of events around bees lately, and actually we have another event coming up in April. We have a book club, and the next book we're reading is The Bees by Laylene Paul. So if anyone
Oh
wants
yeah.
to
Oh, yeah.
attend our book club in April, you can check it out on our website. But
And just to, yeah, that's good. And just if you're in Calgary, you're in a bee city, and so I'm sure the city has on its website things that you can do for bees in the city. And also, if you want to Google, Alberta Native Bee Association and see what they're up to, and see if they're looking for volunteers, that would be great too.
Yeah, those are all great ideas. And yes, you can get local BID guides. They're not always perfect or have every possible bee image on it, but you can get them online for Alberta bees. So we're really grateful for that. Um, Please pass my best wishes on to everyone in the Yukon, and
I will.
I'll be in touch. And best of luck with your forthcoming retirement. And
Oh, no worries. Yeah,
thank
I'm
you
sure
again.
I'll be looking at a lot more bees.
Wonderful. And if you're ever back in Calgary, let me know, Sid. I'd love to take you out for dinner.
Okay. Thanks. Great to see you. Okay.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.